I used to think the reason my family depended on me so much was because I handled pressure well, but after everything that happened with my mother and my sister, I realized the truth was a lot less flattering. They depended on me because I usually hated conflict more than I hated being used, and after enough years of watching me keep the peace, they started treating my patience like something they owned. My sister Leah had been the center of family emergencies for as long as I could remember. If she lost a job, everyone had to talk about it. If she broke up with someone, everyone had to adjust around it. If she got herself into financial trouble, my mother somehow found a way to turn the conversation toward what the rest of us could do to help. I was the opposite kind of person, mostly because I had learned early that nobody was coming to rescue me if I fell apart. I worked, saved, kept my problems quiet, and tried to build a life that didn't require asking anyone for permission. By 26, I had finally bought my first apartment. It was a small condo in an older building, nothing fancy enough to impress anybody on social media, but it was quiet, affordable, and completely mine. The kitchen was outdated, the hallway floor creaked near the bathroom, and the fan over the shower sounded like it was trying to chew through the ceiling, but I loved the place almost immediately because every inch of it represented something I had worked for myself. I spent months fixing it up after work and on weekends because paying contractors for every little thing would have wiped out what was left of my savings. I painted the walls twice after hating the first color, replaced old handles in the kitchen, repaired drywall from YouTube tutorials, rebuilt shelves after mounting them crooked the first time, and slowly turned the apartment from a tired little box into a place that actually felt like home. The couch came from Craigslist. The coffee table was something I refinished in my parents' garage, and even the crooked floating shelves in the living room mattered to me because I remembered the whole frustrating Saturday it took to get them up. My mother had a spare key, and at the time that didn't feel strange. She had watered my plants before when I traveled for work training, let maintenance inside once when I was stuck at the office, and checked on the place a couple times when I was away for more than a day or two. A lot of people trust family with a spare key when there has never been a reason not to, and back then I still believed my family understood basic boundaries, even if they occasionally pushed smaller ones. The first warning signs came through casual comments that were easy to ignore. My mother started bringing Leah up more often during phone calls, usually in that tired voice she used whenever she wanted sympathy before making a request. Leah was having problems with Dan again. Leah felt unstable. Leah was stressed at work. Leah might need some time to figure things out. There was always something, so at first I didn't react much. One Sunday afternoon, my mother came over while I was putting together a bookshelf in the living room. She wandered around with a coffee mug, looking at the paint, the shelves, the couch, and the kitchen like she was quietly measuring my life against my sister's. After a while, she leaned against the counter and said Leah would love living somewhere like this. I laughed and told her Leah could start saving for one. That earned me the disappointed look I had known since childhood, the one that appeared anytime I failed to treat Leah's problems like a family emergency. My mother said Leah was going through a difficult time, and I answered that Leah always seemed to be going through a difficult time lately. She accused me of lacking empathy, and I told her I had empathy, but constantly rescuing someone from consequences was not the same as helping them. The conversation drifted away after that. But looking back now, I think she was testing my reaction. A few days later, Leah texted me asking if she could come see the apartment because our mother wouldn't stop talking about it. That should have made me suspicious because Leah rarely showed interest in my life unless she needed something. But I still wanted to believe she was capable of reaching out without a hidden purpose attached to it. She came over later that week carrying iced coffee and acting friendlier than usual. For the first half hour, everything felt normal enough. She complimented the paint color, the shelves, the couch, and even the cabinet I had nearly dropped on myself while installing it. The whole time, though, she kept looking around the apartment in a way I couldn't fully explain then. It didn't feel like admiration as much as assessment. Eventually, she sat at the kitchen island and said the apartment was honestly kind of perfect. I laughed and said that was exactly why I bought it. But then she kept going, talking about how quiet the area was, how decent the building seemed, and how close everything was without the neighborhood feeling chaotic. Then she told me I had gotten lucky. That word stayed in my head after she left because luck had nothing to do with it. Nobody saw the years of overtime, skipped vacations, cheap food, and careful budgeting that came before the finished version. People usually arrive after the difficult part is over and call the result luck because that is easier than acknowledging the work behind it. Before leaving, Leah casually asked where I kept spare towels in case she ever needed to crash there after drinking downtown one night. The question felt oddly specific, but not specific enough for me to turn it into a serious conversation. About 2 weeks later, I came home from work and saw her car outside my building. At first, I assumed she was visiting briefly, but when I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, I immediately felt that strange discomfort people get when something familiar is suddenly not quite right. There were grocery bags on the counter, shoes near the entrance that definitely were not mine, and one of Leah's jackets hanging over a kitchen chair like it already belonged there. Leah was sitting on my couch eating takeout, while my mother unpacked groceries into my refrigerator as casually as if they had both been there all afternoon. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. My mother simply said she was glad I was finally home, while Leah barely looked up before explaining that Dan had changed the locks after another fight. Before I could process that properly, my mother immediately added that the situation was only temporary. The speed of that answer made me uncomfortable because it sounded prepared, like they had already rehearsed how to present the situation before I walked through the door. I looked around again and noticed a charger already plugged in near the couch, drinks inside my refrigerator, and one of Leah's cosmetic bags sitting near the bathroom sink with the kind of casual permanence that made my stomach tighten. When I asked how long temporary meant, my mother said Leah only needed a few days until things cooled down. Because it had been framed as an emergency instead of someone moving into my apartment, refusing immediately would have made me look selfish before the conversation even started. So against my better judgment, I agreed, and at the time I genuinely believed it would only be for a little while. The first several days seemed manageable. Leah slept on the couch, mostly stayed out of my way, and spent evenings scrolling through her phone while reality television played in the background. It wasn't ideal, but I kept telling myself that a little temporary discomfort was easier than turning the situation into a family war. Then the apartment started changing in small ways that were hard to challenge individually. Her shampoo appeared beside mine in the shower, makeup products spread across the bathroom sink, and packages with her name started arriving every few days. One afternoon I came home and realized she had reorganized my kitchen cabinets because apparently my system didn't make sense. And another night, I opened the dryer to find my clothes wrinkled in a basket because she needed it for her laundry. None of those things felt serious enough by themselves to justify a huge confrontation, but together they created a constant pressure inside my own home. My mother made it worse by acting like the arrangement had already been quietly approved by everyone. Some evenings I would come home from work and find both of them drinking wine in the living room while discussing Leah's future plans in ways that sounded far too comfortable for someone supposedly staying only until things calmed down. One night, I walked into the kitchen and overheard them discussing where a small dining table could fit if a few things got rearranged. The second they noticed me standing there, the conversation stopped, and that silence bothered me more than the words themselves. I pointed out that Leah had already been there almost 3 weeks, and instead of either of them looking embarrassed, they reacted like I was making things awkward for no reason. Leah looked irritated while my mother stepped in again to say she only needed a little more time. By then, though, nobody was behaving like this was temporary anymore. Around the same time, the apartment started operating around Leah's routines instead of mine. I'd come home exhausted and find her spread across the kitchen counter watching videos while dishes and groceries covered the space I needed to cook. Other nights, I'd walk into my own living room and find her friends drinking wine while reality television blasted through my speakers. Leah never acted guilty about any of it. If anything, she behaved like my frustration was the only thing making the situation uncomfortable. One Friday evening, I came home and noticed the apartment smelled different. Scented candles I didn't recognize were burning near the windows. Music I never listened to was playing through the television, and several framed photographs had appeared on the bookshelf beside the couch. They were all hers. Photos with friends, photos at bars, photos with Dan before the breakup, pieces of her life spreading through my living room like the space had already been claimed. She was making tea in the kitchen when I picked up one of the frames and asked why her pictures were suddenly in the living room. She looked confused by the question and said she was trying to make the place feel more comfortable. I told her it already was comfortable, at least for me, and she rolled her eyes before muttering that I had been weird lately. That became the pattern. Leah never acted like somebody knowingly crossing boundaries. She acted like the boundaries themselves were unfair. The situation escalated again when I came home one afternoon and found an internet technician standing in my living room. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought he had entered the wrong apartment, but Leah casually explained that she had upgraded the internet because mine wasn't fast enough anymore. When I asked why she would schedule service for property she didn't own without even discussing it with me, she acted like I should have been grateful and said the faster connection would benefit both of us anyway. That phrase stayed in my head because somewhere along the line she had stopped talking like a temporary guest and started talking like someone who viewed the apartment as shared space. The argument dragged on long enough for my mother to get involved over speakerphone, and by the end of it, she was lecturing me about creating tension at home and making Leah feel unwelcome during an emotionally difficult period. What bothered me was not just the argument, but the way my mother spoke about the apartment like ownership itself had stopped matching the second somebody else needed the space more than I did. The address issue was what made everything feel more serious. At first, it was only a couple bank envelopes near the mailbox, then credit card offers, then insurance documents mixed in with my mail. One night, I asked whether Leah had officially changed her address somewhere, and without looking embarrassed at all, she shrugged and said she needed somewhere stable for important documents. When I pointed out that she should have discussed that with me first, she said I would have made it a whole thing, which pretty much summed up the entire situation because every time I tried protecting a boundary, the problem somehow became my reaction instead of the behavior causing it. That was the first night I seriously wondered whether she planned to leave at all. A few days later, I came home early from work and overheard Leah talking to one of her friends in the living room. She was laughing while explaining that things were better at my apartment than they had ever been with Dan because I barely noticed she was around anyway. Hearing that out loud confirmed what I had already started suspecting. In Leah's mind, this was no longer a temporary inconvenience. It had become normal life. That same evening, I called my mother and told her we needed to seriously discuss Leah moving out because by then she had been there almost 2 months. My mother sighed like I was creating problems out of nowhere and asked why I suddenly had to start conflict now that things had finally stabilized. I explained that Leah was receiving mail there, changing services, reorganizing rooms, and using the apartment like an extension of her own life, while both of them acted like I was unreasonable for noticing it. My mother stayed quiet for a few seconds before saying something that finally made her view of the situation clear. She told me that I had space and Leah didn't. There was no reassurance that Leah planned to leave soon, no apology for how uncomfortable the arrangement had become, and no acknowledgement that maybe it had gone too far. Just a calm statement explaining why, in her mind, the apartment naturally belonged more to the person who currently needed it most. After that call, I stopped treating the problem like awkward family tension and started looking at it practically. I spent a night reading legal forms, tenant disputes, and landlord stories because something in my gut kept telling me the situation had become dangerous in a way I didn't fully understand. The more I read, the worse I felt, because once somebody starts receiving mail somewhere, using the address on paperwork, and keeping belongings there long enough, removing them can become messy depending on local laws. The next day, I called Marco because I needed somebody outside the family to tell me if I was overreacting. I explained the mail, the paperwork, the packages, and the fact that Leah had been staying there nearly 2 months. Marco didn't give me a long speech. He simply told me the situation sounded much more serious than I seemed to realize, then asked whether I had anything in writing proving Leah was only supposed to stay temporarily. When I realized I had absolutely nothing, my stomach dropped. Every conversation had been verbal. Every agreement had been vague. Every attempt to discuss timelines had turned into a conversation about Leah's emotional state instead of actual boundaries. That evening, I found another package by the front door with Leah's name printed directly above my apartment address. Normally, I would have ignored it, but after everything I had read and the conversation with Marco, the label looked different. Leah walked into the hallway while I was still holding it and immediately asked why I was touching her things. I told her I was looking at my address, not her package, and she rolled her eyes before saying it was not a big deal. I finally told her my issue was not one package. My issue was that she had been living there for almost 2 months while acting more and more like the apartment belonged to both of us. She insisted she had never claimed that, but by then I was too exhausted to keep pretending the situation was unclear. I reminded her that she had used the address for paperwork, changed services, spread half her belongings through the apartment, and started reorganizing the place around her routines while everybody acted like I was unreasonable for noticing. She said she was trying to rebuild her life after the breakup, and I told her that rebuilding her life did not mean quietly moving into mine. Before the argument could go much further, my mother walked through the front door using her spare key. To this day, I don't know whether the timing was coincidence or whether Leah had texted her earlier, but the second she saw us standing there irritated, she sighed like she was already tired of hearing my side. Leah immediately reduced the whole thing to me supposedly freaking out over a package, and I remember listening to her explain months of escalating boundary problems like they were one random mood swing that had appeared out of nowhere. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain every detail and simply said I wanted my apartment back. My mother sat at the kitchen counter looking frustrated before reminding me that Leah couldn't afford another place right now, and when I answered that her finances could not be my responsibility forever, she reminded me that Leah was family and that I had extra space anyway. That was the moment everything finally clicked. In their minds, my apartment had quietly become available space that naturally belonged to whoever needed it more. After that argument, Leah got colder, my mother got more defensive, and the apartment became harder to be in. I started staying late at work just to avoid walking into another tense conversation, and some nights I sat in my car outside the building for 20 minutes because going upstairs felt more exhausting than staying in the parking lot. Marco noticed before I admitted it to myself. During dinner one Friday, he asked what would happen if Leah simply refused to leave, and hearing somebody say that out loud made my stomach tighten because it was the exact possibility I had been trying not to fully acknowledge. A few days later, I came home earlier than usual after a meeting got canceled and realized someone else was inside besides Leah and my mother. I walked into the kitchen and found them standing near a middle-aged man holding a tape measure while looking around my living room. My mother looked uncomfortable the second she saw me, but Leah acted like nothing was strange and explained they were looking at furniture options because the current sleeping arrangement was not really working anymore. It took me several seconds to process what she had said because the man was literally measuring my living room. Then my mother explained that Leah needed a proper setup if she was going to be there much longer, and hearing those words out loud made me go cold because nobody was even pretending anymore. They had quietly crossed into planning permanent changes inside my apartment while still expecting me to behave like this was all a temporary favor. I politely told the man there had obviously been a misunderstanding and asked him to leave. To his credit, once he realized what was happening, he looked deeply uncomfortable and apologized before leaving almost immediately. The second the door closed, Leah accused me of humiliating her, while my mother launched into another speech about how difficult the last few months had been and how Leah needed stability. I stopped arguing about smaller details and told both of them the arrangement was ending and Leah needed to start making actual plans to leave. Leah started crying, but she sounded more angry than heartbroken. The conversation circled around how abandoned she felt, how unsupported she felt, and how stressful her life had become, but at no point did she acknowledge what the situation had done to me. Eventually, my mother pulled me aside and asked whether I really wanted to damage my relationship with my sister over an apartment. I told her the apartment mattered because it was the first thing in my life I had truly built for myself, and watching people slowly take control of it while acting like I was selfish for caring had changed the way I saw both of them. She stared at me for a few seconds, then sighed and told me I was being dramatic. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. Even typing that still feels strange because legal action felt like something that happened to other families, not mine. Families fought, guilt-tripped each other, stopped talking for holidays, then eventually pretended nothing had happened. That was the system everyone understood, but that system only worked if nobody crossed the line into trying to take over your home. The lawyer was direct from the beginning. After listening to the story, he asked specific questions about ownership, mail, financial contributions, and how long Leah had been staying there. He explained that while the situation could get messy if I allowed it to continue, the apartment legally belonged to me, and I needed to stop treating the problem like a family disagreement before it became something worse. He told me to document everything, formally establish a timeline, and stop allowing vague verbal conversations to control the situation. So I started documenting. I photographed packages, saved delivery confirmations connected to my address, took pictures showing how much of Leah's property had accumulated throughout the apartment, and backed up every text conversation I could find involving timelines or temporary arrangements. Once everything sat together in one place, the situation looked exactly as serious as it had started feeling. I also contacted building management and explained that only I was authorized to approve residents or access connected to my unit. The conversation was awkward, but the manager updated the file connected to my apartment, and that decision ended up matching sooner than I expected. A few days later, I came home and found Leah and my mother standing inside the apartment looking tense, while several empty cardboard boxes sat near the hallway wall. For a moment, I thought Leah had finally started packing, but then my mother explained they were trying to reorganize the apartment to make things work better long-term. Leah added that they had found a used sleeper sofa online and were thinking about replacing my couch because it would create more room for everybody. Hearing them discuss replacing furniture inside my apartment like I was a passive observer finally ended whatever patience I had left. I calmly told both of them the arrangement was officially over and that Leah had 30 days to move out. My mother looked shocked. Leah stared at me like she thought I was bluffing, and then the argument exploded. They accused me of abandoning family, throwing Leah away during the worst period of her life, and choosing property over people. For the first time since any of this started, I didn't defend myself or explain my feelings again. I simply repeated that Leah had 30 days to leave. That changed the energy immediately because there was finally a deadline attached to something they had expected to keep vague. The next couple weeks were miserable. Leah barely spoke to me unless necessary. My mother called constantly, trying to pressure me into reconsidering, and several relatives suddenly became interested in giving opinions after hearing edited versions of the story from my mother. Apparently, I had become cold. Leah was practically homeless, and I was throwing away family over property. What none of them understood was that the apartment had stopped being about property months earlier. It had become about whether I was allowed to have boundaries at all. The situation finally collapsed 2 weeks before the deadline. I came home from work one evening and realized my key no longer worked. At first, I thought the lock was jammed, but after trying again and getting nowhere, I knocked hard enough for Leah to finally open the door while looking irritated and asking why I was making a scene in the hallway. That was when I realized they had changed the locks. For a few seconds, I couldn't process the entitlement required to lock the legal owner out of his own apartment. Then my mother appeared behind Leah and calmly said everybody needed space to cool down because the environment had become too stressful lately. That sentence killed whatever patience I still had. I walked downstairs, called building management from the lobby, and explained exactly what had happened. Within 20 minutes, security was upstairs with me while the building manager reviewed the ownership documentation connected to the unit. The entire mood changed the second actual authority entered the situation. Leah looked nervous. My mother stopped speaking confidently, and for the first time in months, nobody treated me like I was overreacting. The building manager asked whether they were authorized residents connected to the unit, and when I said no, he asked whether I wanted them removed. I looked past him into the apartment and saw Leah's blankets on the couch, her decorations near the windows, her shoes by the hallway, and all the evidence of how far I had let this go while trying not to be the bad guy. Then I said yes. The next hour was ugly. Leah cried, my mother argued, and security stayed calm while explaining that they were not authorized occupants. Eventually, both of them started packing the things they could take immediately, and once the process actually began, the emotional fog around the whole situation disappeared. The apartment belonged to me. They were not entitled to live there. No amount of guilt changed those facts. By the time they left that night, the apartment looked wrecked more emotionally than physically. Boxes sat everywhere. Furniture had been shifted around. Random belongings still lingered in corners, and the entire place carried the empty feeling that comes after a huge argument. I locked the door behind them and stood there for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt exhausted. Over the next several weeks, I rebuilt the apartment into something that felt like mine again. I threw away anything Leah left behind, changed every lock properly, updated the building access records, and slowly reclaimed the rooms one at a time. Once the daily manipulation stopped, the guilt faded faster than I expected because distance has a way of making abnormal things easier to recognize. A few months later, I heard through relatives that Leah had moved back in with my mother after bouncing between a couple short-term arrangements, and apparently both of them were still telling people I had chosen an apartment over family. That stopped bothering me after a while, because most people who heard the full story asked the same question. They wanted to know why I tolerated it for so long. Honestly, I ask myself that too sometimes. But when you spend enough years being treated like the reliable one, you slowly stop noticing how much you are expected to sacrifice until one day you look around and realize you have been disappearing from your own life just to keep everybody else comfortable. The apartment taught me something I should have learned much earlier. Boundaries mean nothing if people know guilt can erase them. And ever since that situation ended, I have kept one rule with every place I have lived. Nobody gets a spare key anymore.